Hey Bookaholics, and welcome back to another Buddy Read with Me reading vlog. I first saw the Buddy Read vlogs over on Gavin from How to Train Your Gavin's channel. He actually did a collaborative Buddy Read, which I've also been taking part in, and I am part of a group of girls that are doing these Buddy Reads, and I will leave all of that information linked down below, including the playlist for those Buddy Reads. But I figured that over the summer, where I don't actually post real-time vlogs, I would instead post some Buddy Read vlogs, and the one for this month is going to be the Terraformers. The previous one that I did was A Winter's Orbit by Everina Maxwell, and now we're going to be doing the Terraformers. This is a sci-fi dystopia utopia, obviously about terraforming, but also about colonizing planets, and I imagine that it has a lot of discussions around the way we treat not only this fictional planet but our own planet, and I'm very excited to get into it. If you are wanting to buddy read this with me, the way these videos function is that I will be doing full spoiler thoughts, but I will be doing it by sections, so you can either read along with me and therefore check in at the allocated check-in points, or you can read the whole book and then come see my thoughts afterwards. Either or. This one I am going to be doing a little bit differently, because when I finish this book, Orbit, at the end of their books, they do a recommendation, like, if you liked this, try this. And I am going to read this book, and then when I get to the end, I'm going to go see what book it is, right, what the next book is, and then hopefully I will read that one, and I can then compare, see if the recommendation is sound, if that makes sense. So a lot of layers to this, but hopefully we'll have a good time nonetheless. So first of all, I'm going to give you the synopsis, and then we're going to talk about the sections so that you can know exactly when to join me. This story is about Destiny, whose life is dedicated to terraforming Sask-E. As part of the environmental rescue team, she cares for the planet and its burgeoning ecosystems, as her parents did before her. But the bright, clean future they're building comes under threat when Destiny discovers a city full of people that shouldn't exist, hidden inside a massive volcano. As she uncovers more about their past, Destiny begins to question the mission she's devoted her life to, and must make a choice that will reverberate through Sask-E's future for generations to come. I believe it is a generational saga, and the way that we're dividing up this book is the way that the book is already divided. It is in 3 parts, so we're going to have 3 check-ins. So the first part, which is from the beginning of chapter 1 on page 3, all the way through to the end of part 1, which is on page 140. The next one would be part 2, which starts with chapter 22 on page 143 and ends at the end of part 2 on page 256. And then finally we'll be starting part 3, which spans from page 259 through to the end of the book at page 335. We'll have the 3 parts. I believe, as I said, that it is generational, so we will be following different generations in each part, I believe. And we're going to be discussing, yes, terraforming and colonizing a planet. So I'm hoping that if nothing else, it'll be a very discussion heavy video for me, and I'm really excited to chat about the themes of this book. I've heard mixed reviews in regards to people's enjoyment of it, but I am a-okay having fun with just the intellectual side of it, like just discussing what the book is trying to say. So I am excited to give this one a go regardless. I've already put in my little markers to determine where we're checking in. I've got my end of part notes ready to go. I'm going to be tabbing and annotating, and hopefully we'll have a good chat about it. If you do want to join me in the different parts, the timestamps are going to be in the description, and we're going to start with part 1. So I will check back in with my spoilery thoughts for part 1 in a minute. Obviously, if you're just going to read the whole book and then watch the whole video, then proceed as always. Hey vlog, checking in with part 1 of Terraformers. So I have now read all of part 1. I have been tabbing. If you saw the Green Teeth vlog, you'll know how my tabbing system works, but I don't write in the books. I just tab it and then I put sticky notes in so that I can go and reference back to my thoughts. So first of all, we're going to go through the notes that I've made, and then I'll have a quick flick through the tabs in case there's something that I've missed. But first of all, what are the vibes of this book? I have got from Westworld and from Horizon Zero Dawn in this book. We have Westworld in the sense that it's like mega corporation have created this artificial environment with these essentially enslaved beings that are being kept there, in this case to terraform as opposed to for entertainment like in Westworld, but the terraforming is to benefit rich benefactors eventually. like in Westworld. So it's giving me Westworld vibes. The actual world itself is giving me Horizon Zero Dawn vibes, in the sense that we've got all of these artificial animals and artificially enhanced humans that are living on this planet to contribute with its terraforming, and there's hierarchy within that, which I'll get into a bit later. But the vibe of the world, very nature-based, very little human marking on it, is where we're at. And then the other thing that I'm getting from it, weirdly, is the Estes duology that I read by Esther Atwell. I do have a review for it. I'm getting that in the sense that we have our protagonist as someone who is very naive and believes very much in the system that they are part of, and it's not until their eyes are opened by encountering another group of people that they are then able to see and understand exactly the scope of what is going on. So we've got all of that, which I do genuinely enjoy all of that media, so I am excited to see that combined within this book. The world building itself sometimes I think is a little bit too confusing. I think that there are too many concepts that are dropped that aren't explored in enough depth within the time in which they are explained. So sometimes we'll reference back to something we saw several chapters ago and elaborate on it more. It's like I could have done with that elaboration when it was first brought up, as opposed to waiting several chapters for it to be explained. But that's a personal preference thing. I really like that the protagonist is on the right side of naive. We've got this cute naiveness about it, as opposed to it being really frustrating and infuriating, like she's an idiot. So I like that. The pacing is probably the weakest point for me at the moment. There are definitely chapters that just drag for no reason, and then chapters where too much is happening. There's so many reveals happening, so many things unfolding in like a very short amount of time, and I feel like the pacing is a little bit all over the place there. So that's probably the biggest detriment of the book at the moment, but it's not actually impeding my enjoyment per se. It's just the weakest element within the book. The writing style itself is very matter of fact, straight to the point. It very much is just telling you as is. I suspect because it's from what this character experiences. It's not in first person, it's in third person, but we're very much following this one character, and this character seems like the kind of person that gets straight to the point and doesn't really have much time for metaphor or allegory. And I am appreciating that because it does suit the style of story it is, especially because we've got so many concepts and ideals and they have to be somewhat condensed. So I am appreciating that. The themes. This is a very theme heavy book. That's why I wanted to do a dedicated vlog to it. And the themes are actually quite a few. First of all, we have environmentalism being the key one, main selling point. This is environmental fiction. So we have obviously this planet that is being built to resemble Earth, and therefore almost like a clean slate for humanity. And we have lots of discussions around the likes of recreating Earth so that we can do better with it, so that we don't damage it, discussing carbon emissions, misuse of certain elements, even things like talking about what different infrastructures are made of, like so infrastructure for the humans, what they're made of and how they justify it. So every single use of any kind of element is justified in this character's mind almost. There needs a justification. If you're going to cut down a tree for wood, you need to justify it, and you need to see that it's countered in some way, that it's not going to cause any kind of ramifications impact wise, which was interesting to be reading about. That then bleeds into things like there are ideas around being against animal consumption and the treatment of animals, because we have animal companions in here that are sentient, and we'll get into that a little bit later, but there are sentient animals in here, so the consumption of animals is deemed really disgusting in this world as well, because obviously it's all about trying to create biodiversity, trying to create life, that then consuming an animal seems outlandish before you factor in the fact that you've got sentient animal companions. Then on top of that, we have a huge anti-capitalist manifesto going on in here. We have the way that you have billionaires treating planets in a way that as though they own the entire planet, and therefore all of the work of multiple people over multiple generations creating this environment that is in equilibrium, that is balanced, that is working the way it's supposed to. We have that in a way that works because it's tended to by people who care. And then you have these billionaires that are investors that are wanting real estate on this planet because they want to go back to idealized Earth past, which we'll talk about again also in a minute, we have an interesting conversation around the way that rich people treat the planet, because they're the ones that would potentially then be able to leave the planet, and it would be the inhabitants that would be left to pick up the pieces, etc. So a very anti-capitalist, a lot of discussions around mega corporations and vilifying mega corporations, which I thought was really cool. Another thing that we have discussed in here is the importance of personhood, including things like caste systems. So in this particular case, we have these animal companions that are sentient, and they are programmed specifically to be sentient. And then there is a rating system that assesses the intelligent assessment criteria, I think is what it's called. And they all call it INAS because they don't like the system. But basically different animals and different companions will be given a different rating. And we find out later on in the book that that is specifically bottlenecked. So you'll have all of these sentient creatures that are equally sentient, but to be able to treat them as lesser, you bottleneck their intelligence. So you give them very limited vocabulary, or you give them very limited ability to express themselves, or very little autonomy, so that then you can treat them as lesser, so that you can create a caste system in which these enslaved beings, these people who are owned by these corporations specifically to terraform these planets, are then going to be used in different manners due to their assessment, due to this caste system, so that then even they themselves will treat people of different castes differently. And it's interesting because they refer to the sentient beings as people. So for example, there are actual just ordinary animals on this planet, and then there are the sentient animals. So at one point we meet like mole rats, and this protagonist didn't know that the mole rats had sentience. So then she's like, oh, the mole rats are people. So like a lot of discussion around what makes a person and the sentience versus biology that comes with being considered a person. So that was a really interesting conversation. And then that obviously feeds into the next theme, which is slavery and forced labor, in which case we have these people on these planets that have been made by this corporation, and therefore they are owned by this corporation, very much like in Westworld, and therefore have no autonomy. And that was a really interesting conversation in and of itself, and I really did appreciate it, because it's discussing not only the caste system, but also then the fact that that caste system is relevant to this planet. But then on top of that, they can't even leave this planet. They're on a planet that is owned, and therefore they are owned, and they can be literally put down if they are disobeying, and etc. So that was also a very important theme. And then the other theme that I said I would touch upon is that we do have the idealizing of Earth's past, especially by rich people. You have people who are actively destroying our planet, in this case fictional, in our case real. Billionaires and rich corporations that actively are destroying our planet, but they're the same people that would love the idea of like a Westworld-like environment where they could experience nature the way it was supposed to be, the way that we were back in the good old days of Neanderthals. And I think that's so fascinating because it's so true. The same way you'll have tech billionaires that talk about how amazing it would have been to have been a knight or to have been a Viking, and they're the same people who are literally creating an environment where we as a planet would not be able to sustain that anymore. And it was fascinating to look at. So a lot of conversations going on in this book. So let's go have a flick through the tabs. From the very start, we have a lot of conversations around human impact on planets, including things like the way that we burn things, the way that we consume animals, the way that we'll just chop down trees, the very little regard for biodiversity, etc. Again, a lot of interesting points about idealizing history and idealizing nature while not actually respecting the nature at all. Just idealizing the parts of nature that benefit you. So in this case, it's I want to go hunt with a spear and I want to go kill an animal and skin it alive because that's how we used to live, instead of, we used to live much more harmoniously with the planet. We have our companion in here. So our protagonist is called Destry, but she has a companion who is her mount, and therefore he kind of has to obey her, but she doesn't like the in-ass system that I talked about before. So she has this moose who is her mount, and he can fly, which is pretty cool, and his name's Whistle. I really like Whistle. So here is the section in which we go to where they live, and there's a huge amount of emphasis on the fact that where the humans specifically live is in a wooden house while the rest aren't. But this wooden house is fine because it was from an area where the trees had been growing there for quite a long time, and there was a section that needed cutting down so that it could grow again, so it could rejuvenate this part of the forest. So they justified the cutting down of these particular trees. Therefore, they used the wood to create a house, which I thought was interesting. They mentioned pierogi, and I had to tab that because pierogi his life. One of the creepy, not nice characters that we meet very, very early on in the book, who was one of those that was going around hunting and killing animals for sport, happens to be a billionaire son, spoiled rich kid. So again, not very innovative, but very predictable and very in keeping with the themes. I did find by this point, I've got a note here that there were a lot of things that are unfolding very quickly and that everyone seemed a little too okay with what was going on. And while I appreciate that these characters are quite naive, the ones they're talking to aren't. And I feel like you should have some kind of at least suspicion or trepidation when dealing with a whole new group of people you've never heard of before, because this is when they enter into the volcano, like it says on the back, where there's a whole new group of people living, apparently been living there for centuries. And these guys are just, yeah, okay, yeah, we'll come on in, we'll see what you're up to. Like, and these guys are like, yeah, come on in. And everyone seemed very okay with everything that was going on, like encountering a whole new group of people that shouldn't be on your planet. So that was an interesting one. A lot of interesting conversations around the different type of hominids. So we've got like Homo sapiens, and then we've got Homo arcanus, Homo diversus, which was all very interesting. Lots of different subspecies of humans that have progressed past where we are at now. We also have lots of conversations around the importance of water and water preservation, and also the impact of rerouting water. They had a whole conversation about water being diverted, but to use pre-existing streams or like areas where the water used to flow previously so that it still feels organic to this water as though it's a living entity was really interesting. There was also a good conversation around dogs. So we were talking about like these sentient animals, and then it was like, dogs, but dogs aren't sentient. And I thought, interesting that the dogs wouldn't be the first ones that humans made sentient. But it turns out that after some accords that happened still on Earth way back when, dogs had seen how they'd been treated as like man's best friend and decided that they didn't want anything to do with humans anymore once they became more sentient, which I thought was interesting. Yeah, the idea of capitalists like billionaires having no consequences. Sometimes the naivety of the protagonist became a bit of a detriment to like her ability to process what could potentially be going on. There is also, because these animals are like biologically enhanced, I don't know how much of it is organically sentient versus made to become more sentient through tech. I don't know. Conversations around carbon cycles, which was really important. We had a brief conversation around eugenics. So we had like these first humans that were made for this planet to help terraform it. The whole idea is that their species will die out to make way for this newer, potentially improved version of humans, which was interesting. We had interesting conversations around biological, or in this case, geological warfare, including the threat of setting off tectonic plates, for example. That was an interesting one. We had the animals who have, until this point, had very little autonomy being pivotal to this rebellion that we are watching happen. So that was really good. The doctor that tends to Whistle when Whistle gets injured, being a dick to Destry because Whistle hasn't been treated properly, was interesting, because obviously like they're blaming Destry as though Destry has any say on it, but obviously because she still outranks Moose, it like they still think of it as her problem, even though it's kind of not. And it was an interesting conversation to have. But like the whole conversation around holding back Whistle's intellect and like bottlenecking his intellect, the literal line was, I'm just as intelligent as I always was, right? The only difference is you have to listen to me now. That was important because that is literally what happens in our world. You have the poorest citizens, those who will continue to provide manual labor for the working classes, are the ones that are in under-provided schools, that are given less access to education, that are in less positions to be able to improve their lot. So it is literally confining their education and their abilities to get a better job. And it was kind of similar here. Obviously, here it's more like within their brain they're being bottlenecked, but it's kind of commentary on the same thing. So the only other thing left to say on this first part that didn't work for me, and then the things that I really liked. So what didn't work for me about the ending of part one is that the conditions under which the big mega corporation isn't going to just go murder everyone is that if Destry returns back into the fold, which just seemed weird to me, because why they would want someone who is very clearly going to cause problems and who clearly doesn't believe in the ethos of this company anymore, force her back to be around the people that betrayed her and were in favor of the corporation and decided to alert the corporation of what was going on. Well, surely she's going to eventually start creating dissent. So for example, they're going to have her train up a different ranger, and they're going to like basically put her on desk duty, and she can't go ranging around anymore, and she basically can't leave the city anymore, so they can constantly keep an eye on her. But what was weird is, yes, just that now she's going to be training up someone else, someone young and impressionable, and you think, well, surely she's a dissenter, like you wouldn't want her around, but okay, whatever. But I did really like the idea that we've got this protagonist who the only way that they can kind of save everyone from this war that is on the brink of happening, the only way she could stop it is if she returns to the fold, and she just does, and she just kind of gets on with it. It's not like, woe is me, huge martyrdom. It's just like, do you know what, I still did the right thing, and I really did appreciate that. I've talked quite a bit about part 1. I've got 2 more parts to go. Hopefully I continue to have loads to say, and I will check back in when I have read part 2. Hey vlog, checking in again because I have now read part 2 of the Terraformers, so I thought I would talk to you about it. I have been tabbing again, still a lot to say, and I also have my notes for at the end of the section. Now, my notes I have divided into pros and cons. I have 5 pros and 4 cons, which I will talk about in a sandwich fashion. So it'll be pro, con, pro, con, pro. And this is because in this part I did have more issues. There were more things that I wasn't clicking with. Things that from the previous one I thought were deliberate, that it turns out are just actually part of the way the story is going, and there wasn't as much of a conversation around them as I initially allocated to them, etc. So let's talk about that. First pro is that we have a very interesting conversation around the importance of durable, sustainable, and accessible public transport. This is because in this part we are now at the end of terraforming, in which we are including things like public services. So we're at the point now where people are actually living on this planet that aren't just the people that were sent there to terraform it. We do have residents now. So we have things like the need for public services, including public transport. The main focus of this one being about public transport, there being a regulation in place that means that public transport is a legal requirement. So it did discuss the need for public transport and who public transport most benefits and what it actually contributes to society and its central, key, important role that it holds within any modern society. And I think that was handled in a really interesting way. I think the conversations around accessibility, so for example, making sure that it is available for any member of the public to be able to access, for example, and then any areas and the regularity, the maintenance, etc., all of that was super important as a conversation. Now, the first con that I'm going to point out is that we do have more romantic / sexual tension going on in this part, and I wasn't really vibing with it. One of the issues that I had is that, so in the first part, there is a level of innocent, almost young, juvenile tone at times to the book that I had attributed to it being almost like allegory for how young and juvenile the planet is, how young and juvenile the people living on it are, like they're kind of in this bubble, in this forced naivety, and that is reflected in the writing style. But that wasn't the case. That was just assuming that, because the writing style has persisted into this part, which is more like the adolescence of this planet, if you're kind of looking at it like that. So then having this tone along with the sexy times was a bit odd, and then on top of that I just didn't think they were adding anything. And I'm not saying that sex scenes always need to mean something. In a book that is so meaningful and has so many conversations and is trying to talk about so many things, for us to take a brief detour just so that some characters can get it on just felt a bit odd and out of place, and I wasn't vibing with it. There is one of the scenes that makes sense, the others do not. I'm not against there being sex in the book. I think the one that actually did strike up a conversation made sense. The rest of it was just a bit weird and I don't really see the point in it. That's just like a personal opinion thing. The next pro that I have is that I really did enjoy that someone was talking about the way that corporations will undermine public services to promote privatization. So basically, you will have a public service that is so useless, so mismanaged, so deliberately bad, that people will use private services instead, then the public thing will become obsolete. It's like, oh, well, no one's using it, so we won't do this anymore, which then in turn leads to privatization of things. We had this in the UK. Our trains got privatized, and they're not any better. They're not any more efficient. They're just more expensive. The only thing they are is more expensive, but they are not a public problem anymore. And this is something that is being discussed here, the way that we will deliberately do absolute bare minimum for public services so that people want to use private services, so that we can discontinue the public service and that cost is no longer on governments. And I think that was an important and an interesting conversation to be having within this book. The next thing that was a con for me is something that I had actually kind of liked in the first part, and I think the second part kind of undermined it a bit. We had another conversation again about personhood, about what makes someone a person. As I said in the first part, we do have sentient animals that are considered people because they are sentient, and that was good. And we had another conversation around, oh, well, this can only be done by a person, and then one of the sentient robots being like, oh, what's a person, and that was an important conversation, but the layering to it ended up getting so complicated that I think it undermined itself. It was a little bit like there's still a criteria for personhood, and I really liked in the first part that it was fluid and now it's not. However, I do kind of think that it's deliberate. I think that it's potentially you're just seeing it from a different angle, from a different character, and maybe we go back to that again in the third part. That's what I'm hoping, because otherwise they've just kind of undermined themselves. Like, not deliberately, like they were very much trying to say no, like all of these are people, but there were just certain things that it's like, oh, but you're kind of drawing a line here and there shouldn't be one. So yeah, I felt a bit odd about that. One of the things that I did like is the way that governments neglect the public services and public infrastructure in poorer or periphery areas. So they will always focus the majority of their attention on the more metropolized areas, which in theory makes sense because there are more people in the metropolis, so you would be serving more people. But that logic is literally put in place so that they can neglect anyone who isn't falling in line and isn't just in the metropolis. It means that poor people, it means that people who, for example, people who don't live in cities a lot of the time, for example, are agriculture workers or don't work in the fields that most benefit the status quo of classism, they get less focus, and therefore they get less means, they get less amenities, and they get less services. And I did really like that it kind of did address that, and the way that that affects people, the way that, for example, if you have a pothole or a manhole that's broken in the middle of a busy city, it's going to get fixed sooner than out in the sticks, and that's a fact. And it kind of talked about that and why that really shouldn't be the case. It is something, as someone who lives in the countryside, we go whole weekend without water. So we have a water tank that supplies us with water so that we can still brush our teeth and flush toilets, because we have gone a whole weekend without running water without that tank before. Our electricity goes off sometimes, not so much now, but when I was a kid we would easily go 24 hours without electricity because it would get flicked off, because I'm in rural Spain. So it is something that I have been directly affected by, so it was an interesting conversation to have, and I think it was handled well. So I'm assuming this author at some point has maybe lived in the countryside or known someone that's lived in the countryside and seen that scarcity of amenities, like things that I think people in cities just genuinely have never thought of. One of the things that I think was handled a little bit on the poorer end was conversations around consent. This ties directly into my issue with personhood, actually, because the idea around personhood and consent in this are almost intrinsically linked to your ability to communicate. So it's not just about your sentience, it's whether or not you are a person, and whether or not you can consent is entirely based on your ability to converse, be it through text, because they sometimes Bluetooth text each other's brains, or they will talk orally. And there's a conversation around, for example, animal versus human in this world, because you have animal people and animals. The conversation there being, for example, how certain animals can't consent, so cows can't consent to giving milk, for example. I think is the example used in here. Yes and no, because we've already had a conversation around a lot of these animals have actually got a level of sentience, it's just that it's bottlenecked. So I already talked about this in part 1, where the intellect is bottlenecked so that it specifically can suit different criteria so that people can get treated differently or lesser, more importantly. And within this there's okay, so that's a sentient animal, but they can't communicate, so they're not considered a person, and they can't give consent. One, you can give consent without using words. Rapists constantly use the "you didn't say no" as a way to justify their acts. You can tell if someone is consenting to something. You can tell if an animal is consenting to something. Consent is not intrinsically linked to communication, and neither is personhood. So I didn't like that. I think that those two things are interconnected, but they do also have a little bit of disparity, because personhood being connected to sentience, being connected to communication, was one avenue that didn't work for me. But then consent being connected to verbal interaction also was icky, but in a slightly different way. So the emphasis on communication via either text or orally was not the best message, and I wasn't the biggest fan. So you can be sentient and not communicate, but then that means that you're not a person. I don't like there being a criteria. That makes me uncomfortable. I understand the author is trying to talk about things. She's trying to bring attention to these things and make you think of these things. I just didn't like the angle it was pitched at in this book, in this part of the book anyway. One of the things that I do think was handled really, really well, though, in terms of consent, because again, not everything about consent was an issue, hence why I had it as separate parts. But one of the things that I did really like was the discussion around psychological and physical autonomy, bodily and mental autonomy. Very important conversation in here. We are following a protagonist who, whatever he touches is data collected, like he is covered in sensors. All of his senses are sensors. So anything he touches or looks at or whatever is data that's collected and then sent to big corporate that he's enslaved by. So he is, for example, if he has sex, that data is collected by the corporation. So there was interesting conversations there, because it's also about, for example, being made for purpose. So we're talking throughout this part of the story, we are following them as they're trying to build, as I said, public transit, and they have their heart set on trains. So they've talked about making a sentient train, which is interesting in and of itself. But we have one character who objects to making a sentient train, because he's like, but what if the train doesn't want to be a train? What if the train doesn't want to transport people around? And everyone's getting angry with him about this, because they're all saying, but if you're made for a purpose, you're going to be happy with that purpose. And he's like, well, I was made for a purpose and I'm not happy. I am not happy at all with my situation, especially because I'm monitored so heavily, because I'm their most valuable asset, because I'm their most expensive gadget. So I understood that completely, and that was a really interesting and important conversation around autonomy, bodily autonomy, and also like purpose and what you're built for. Conversations was really, really well handled, because there was nuance to it, because we had those that were kind of saying, if you have a sentient train, it will actually know like the best, most efficient routes for those on board, instead of just going a programmed route. And also then it will be harder to remove because it's sentient. It was an interesting conversation. I didn't necessarily agree with the opposing side and them wanting to make a train, but I understood where everyone was coming from. However, that's also partly a con. The con for me here being that I think if you're going to have a conversation around the nuance that comes with bringing a sentient life, be it, for example, giving birth to a human in our world, or making a sentient train, you need to have it with a lot more nuance than this book had when you're talking about bringing life into a difficult society. In this case, they are in a society in which people are frequently enslaved. It is taken over by mega corporations to deliberately try and enslave people. This is something that gets used a lot when we talk about crisis areas. If you talk about anywhere where there's a famine, if you talk about anywhere where there's genocide, anywhere where there's war, it's like, why are they having babies? Why are so many people having babies during that? Why are so many people having babies in Gaza right now? Why would anyone still have a baby in Ukraine right now? And it's like, hold up. And that conversation needed to be more nuanced, I think, because you had two opposing views on why we should or should not bring this sentient train to life. But it was done in a way that I don't think actually really discussed anything. And for a book that's been so discussion heavy, to just kind of like bring it up and then just be a bit like, well, a train would be good. And that's it. It's like, oh, obviously, I appreciate we're talking about a train, but we're still talking about a sentient being. And when we're trying to discuss a book that has very much blurred the lines between sentient and human, like, sentient just means person now. So you still have the same, you are a person, you're being built for a specific purpose and brought into this horrible world that is going so badly. We're gonna love you, so it will be fine. And it is a conversation that so many parents, any of us have ever looked at our kids and then looked at the state of the world and just been like, I'm so fucking sorry. I'm so fucking sorry. We've all felt that, you know? And it would have been a really important conversation to have, and it just wasn't had. And that bothered me. But the last thing that I will say as a positive was we did have a very interesting conversation surrounding corporate rivalry and the way that that has larger scale effects. So, for example, you will have a corporation that wants to undermine, undercut, or outdo another rival mega corporation, and the way that that will be tackled is it will literally impact the public. It'll impact the company eventually, but the way they hash it out will initially impact the public. So it will be through further exploitation of workers so that they can make cheaper products, so that they can outpace their competition. It will be that they will try and push something out of the market, try and outprice something so that they can get over their rivalry with their competitors. And that is something that I thought was handled quite interestingly as well. So now, as last time, we'll go quickly through the tabs. So first of all, we start out with the treaty that was brokered at the end of part 1 being a kind of historic event now, and people with differing opinions on whether or not it was a good thing or a bad thing. I was kind of upset about the fact that this starts a year after Destry dies. Like, I appreciate we kind of needed Destry out of the picture so that we can move on with a new character, but it still was kind of sad that it's like, it's only been a year. It's been 700 years. We're 1 year off Destry dying. Like, that felt a bit cheap, I'm not gonna lie. We did have also themes including bureaucratic and governmental red tape in here, especially when it comes to public services. That was quite interesting. My next tab is literally just how exactly does a cow scoop and probe? Like, we have this cow robot sentient person thing, and they're taking samples because they need to like look at the terrain of the area to make sure it's stable for a train. It says that the cow is scooping and probing, and I'm like, how are they scooping and probing? There's no further description or information about how they would be holding said equipment for the scooping and probing, just that they are. Is that okay? We get introduced to construction workers who then have to deal with their own kind of level of red tape, because so they work for the corporation that is building this city, and they're not supposed to interact with the corporation that owns the planet without it going through corporate. So it's all very complicated, and that was quite interesting. We did finally get a bit more of a description around pronouns and biology, including things like the construction workers will introduce themselves with a name and a pronoun. So it'd be like, for example, if it were me, I'd be like, I'm Faye, using she, her, so that you know who you're talking to immediately. And that is really cool. I really like that. I literally put a tab in here that was like, big corporations buying up residential real estate? Well, I never. I'm sarcastic, even in my notes. The protagonist, Misha, and his friend Zest are an interesting duo because Misha has all of these sensors, he gets really overwhelmed with information, and Zest, the cow mount that he has, calms him down like a therapy dog, I suppose. And it's really interesting because obviously because then you have these other characters that are like, well, you literally rely on this other person to be able to exist. And it's really interesting the way that the relationships are kind of discussed in here. There is a section in here that is talking about intellectual property theft. So, for example, if you are within the boundaries of this certain city, any noise that you make, so your voice or even your fart sound as is used in here, can actually be used by this corporation. So they kind of can take that from you, which again, very interesting time to be reading a book that mentions intellectual property theft, huh? What got weird here is we have a section in this pub where they have different acts on. It's kind of like a burlesque club. They have pole dancing, but then they also have like comedy acts, and the order of it was weird because it's like literally it goes from like, it starts with pole dancing / stripping, and then it goes into comedy, and then it goes into parrots singing, and then it goes back into stripping. It was a weird time. It's like, I don't know, I'm not sure I personally would want my strip club to also be a comedy club. I don't know. This section got a bit better when they did start acting like a team, but then again we had a fallout again later, so it only picked up for a little bit. We had interesting conversations around border control, including now that we have privatized cities, but also there are other cities where, for example, you're not allowed to fly in. They have this like anti-gravity like mesh over it, so if you try and fly in or fly over it, it knocked you down. Actually killed people, but they don't care because you're not allowed in our borders. And that says so much about, you know, like when you talk about refugee crises and you have people coming in and it's like, no, we're going to send you back on your dinghy kind of mentality, or you're going to die, but you're not my problem and you're not allowed in here. So that was interesting because you have to get your ID checked to be able to go into these cities. And yeah, that was an important conversation as well. And then the very last note that I have in here is, okay, so we're adopting a train. That seems perfectly normal because so Misha and then Sulfur, who is the other guy that we're following in this story. Sulfur is one of the ones from Spider City, so from the volcano people from the first part. And then Misha is Destry, the protagonist of the first part, her apprentice, the one that she trained up. Now we have Sulfur, who's the one from Spider City, is going to adopt the train. He's going to apply to be the parent of the train, and like he's bonding with the train. And like I appreciate that it's like a whole conversation around sentience, but like my tiny brain can't compute what parenting a train is. I parent 4 kids, you know, they're practically a train, but I don't understand how you parent a train. So there's that. So that's that part done. So we have one part left. It seems quite short as well. I don't even think it's 100 pages. And then we will wrap the whole thing up. Hey vlog, checking in because I have now finished The Terraformers by Annalee Newitz. I tabbed less in this third part. It's less than 100 pages anyway, so there is just less. But if you look the way it's distributed, I've got lots more tabs in the front half than I do in the bottom half. I just don't have quite as much to say. A lot of it is repeating stuff I've already said in previous parts. A lot of the things that were in this part are again repeats within themselves, so I only needed to like tab it once. So let's talk about it a little bit. Let's go through once again the notes and then I will quickly flick through the tabs. This time I have higher problem to positive ratio. So we're going to go 2 cons 1 pro, 2 cons 1 pro, 2 cons 1 pro. So we'll end on a positive note. So first of all, my first issue being that I wasn't a huge fan of the amount of hints of off-world stuff. So other planets or other parts of this galaxy. We get loads of hints, mentions of things, and then nothing more. For me, personally, it was either go talk about these things and make a longer book or make a series and actually discuss them, or don't bother, because the way that it was mentioned, it's kind of like we're supposed to know these things because the characters know these things, and therefore I just didn't feel like it added anything. I mean, I understand that it's trying to show that there is a world outside of this world, the impact that will possibly have, etc. I just didn't feel like it was done in a way that felt satisfying. It was more just like, oh, you know, here's the thing I'm going to cursory mention. It's like, okay, we're not going to talk about that again. All right. But on themes, the first thematic issue that I had, this whole section is about gentrification. We are following the train from the previous section. So it starts where this train is on its track and then there's a cat named Moose, who has had to leave his home in Larange, which is the main like city from the first part, because it's no longer affordable to live there and it's getting harder and harder for the non-human looking people to get a home or a job, etc. So we're talking again about gentrification, and then this cat is going to go live on this train for a while. Like the train's just like, yeah, we'll just stay on board me until you figure it out. The way that we're talking about gentrification, bearing in mind that a lot of these people can live for centuries, this is set about 800 years after the events of the previous section, when this train was born. These creatures are living for centuries, and yet the gentrification has happened in 2 years. Anyone who has read anything on gentrification, the scariest thing about gentrification is that it's so subtle. You don't notice that you're being gentrified until you're already halfway through the gentrification process. It makes it harder for people to rise up against it. If a big corporation just comes in and starts buying all the houses immediately, it would be much easier to push back against it. But instead, it's always pitched as this organic thing, as this thing that's like, well, you know, just, it happens. You know, you can't afford to live here anymore. It's one of those things. Instead of there being like huge legislations being put in place, it's just, oh, you know, it happened. These things happen, you know, cities, living organisms. We'll just push you out because it's organic. And that's the problem with gentrification, is the almost gaslighting that comes with it most of the time. Well, this one, it's like legal issues. And I understand that we're trying to draw parallels to times in our past where this has happened, where we literally have been like, you know, all Irish people need to get out of here. All of the Black people need to get out of here. All of the Islamic people need to get out of here. And, you know, they're pushed out, you know, like we're seeing in Gaza now, you know. I think one of the problems that we have have as privileged parts of our culture is that we don't understand that these processes go on for substantially longer before we start hearing about them. The issue in Gaza hasn't been happening since 2022. It's been happening for decades. The issue in Ukraine didn't start happening a couple years ago. It started back in 2014. Like, these are things that have been going on for a long time. They just don't get widespread media until we're so far into the throes of it that then it becomes a public concern. And I think that then this author treating it where like gentrification can happen in 2 years as opposed to it being this long-standing process that has lots of precedent to it is a disservice to the process of gentrification and the people being gentrified. So while I understand that it's a short book and it's for the purpose of still highlighting the issue, which is important, I think that when you're talking about creatures that can live for centuries, the fact that you're doing all of this in a 2-year span is a bit not right. I don't know, but that's just a me thing. And obviously I don't know as much about gentrification as other people do. So it's potentially that I'm the one in the wrong. This is just something that my personal thoughts have led to, because gentrification is a systemic issue that stems a long period of time, not just something that happens in a couple of years just off of the back. So there's that. I mean, like, it was like briefly mentioned in the previous part, but it was more, I don't know, more that we would make ghettos and boroughs. But yeah, I don't know, just didn't sit right with me the way that it was done. One of the conversations I did like about gentrification was obviously the way that it's discussed, in the sense of it's removing people from their homes, from their ancestral lands, from places where they have grown up, where their parents lived, etc. And the way that gentrification functions is normally through financial means, so it gets higher and higher and higher living costs in the area until the people who originally lived there can no longer afford to live there. So that was an interesting conversation, but one of my favorite things about the conversation was actually about second home ownership. In this case, you have billionaires that don't live on the planet all the time. They just have this humanoid body that they can put their consciousness in. So basically you have these houses that are for these bodies, and then every now and then a human will come and inhabit it. Half the time these houses are empty or not actually being used, at least. That happens a lot. You have like people where they have holiday homes, second homes, etc., that are pushing people who would live in those homes permanently out of their homeland simply for the purpose of you being able to have a vacation home. So I think that was a really important conversation, and it was well discussed. Next thing that I did have an issue with is the lack of continuity when it comes to discussing the environment. So in the first part, there is a huge emphasis on balance, on biodiversity, on how to create the planet in a sustainable way. The amount of work that went into making sure that this planet functions as a planet after being terraformed. And one of the issues is that, it's not really mentioned again. So you've got all of these humans suddenly living here, all of this impact on the environment, all of this impact on the animal life, all of the other additional issues that would come with, and it's not really talked about anymore. So we talk about, we won't build out of wood because we won't fell the trees. We won't kill animals because it impacts the biodiversity, blah, blah. All of these really like hyper specific things in the first part, and we don't even get broad strokes by the third part, like as though talking about environment was just allocated to the first part and we don't need to talk about it again. And I feel like when it was so heavily emphasized in the first one, the fact that then we don't really have much of a discussion around it by the third part, aside from cities aren't great, it's not the best. Like, I don't know, I feel like pick a lane a little bit. If you're going to talk so heavily about something, you do need to show its evolution, and I would have liked there to have been more of that, and there just kind of wasn't. Another issue that I had here is the way that we prioritize Spider City's rights over all other cities. So authors do this a lot. I talked about this in my romance vlog when I talked about Guild by Raven Kennedy. It's something that happens in lots of different fantasies and sci-fis, is that you'll have a character or a place or a thing that we are taught is precious. You spend a lot of the book's time with that character, or you spend a lot of the book's time in that setting, and we are therefore driven to build an emotional connection with this person, place, or thing. And what happens is that then we will highlight that thing's rights in a way that means that its rights are actually more valuable. So in this case, Spider City is the place that we have been taught is where people go, where they want freedom, where they do not belong to any of these corporations. It's a seat of rebellion. What happens is that we will then see this author will accidentally be like, okay, so the rights have been eroding in all of these cities for a long time. This city's being gentrified. This city is using more slaves. This city is closing its borders. You will see all of these things happen. And then it will be, now they're coming for Spider City and they're going to do these things to Spider City as well. well. And that's what you're not going to stand for. And it's like, I don't know, I wasn't standing for it when it was happening in Left Hand or in L'Orange. I wasn't standing for it already. Just because Spider City is the place that is free doesn't mean that the impact of it is worse than the impact of the cities that are owned by this corporation. To me, it was already a bad thing. So then the author angling it as like, this has been happening here, this has been happening here, and now it's going to happen to Spider City. And it's like, well, kind of sucked when it was happening to the other two places. I don't like when authors do that, and I don't think they do it on purpose, but it's just something that happens. And because they've built this city or this person or this thing or whatever, and therefore they've got the emotional connection to it, and they've been focusing on it, so they assume you'll have the emotional connection to it, and therefore you're going to be even more annoyed by it. It happens in 12 Years a Slave. It's like, well, he was a free man and then got enslaved, and it's like, do you know what? The other slaves also should be free because they're people. So I don't know, it happens a lot. And I understand why it happens. It's just not a narrative framework that works for me. It actually ends up annoying me. Something that I did like was the emphasis on the importance of public spaces, the way that public spaces aid those who are homeless, those who are down on their luck, those who are suffering in some way, shape or form. In this case, we do have Moose the cat living on the train, and the train being a free entity, meaning that it's not going to cause a problem for Moose. We do have like an interesting, that's what libraries are for. Libraries help people get back on their feet. Libraries are a fantastic place for people who are impoverished, people who are in need of some kind of social assistance. Libraries are fantastic for that. Support your local libraries, by the way, people. Public services being a huge and important factor and something that can be life-changing and something we shouldn't lose was also a really important point of this book that I really did appreciate. One of the things that I'm not sure if it's a pro or a con or just a weird thing, but I do need to mention is there was a conversation around indigeneity. So there was a conversation around the type of human bodies that are used on Saskia, this planet. They have different genomes that are based on, I think it was European, African, and Indigenous. And lots of people went for Indigenous because they thought it meant like the most authentic human as opposed to just Native Americans. I thought it was interesting because it was like, back in the day, humans really cared about their race. So Indigenous was just a category of people. On the one hand, I kind of get what it's saying in the sense of like, now the race of people doesn't matter because it's the species of people that matters and stuff. That's really erasing the importance of cultural heritage. So like, yes, racial heritage is intrinsically linked to cultural heritage. Native American people aren't all entirely Native American by race, but they are culturally, and that is mostly due to colonial impact, and that's a huge conversation this book wasn't ready to have. So for it to bring it up and then just be like, because race used to matter to people, and it's like, okay, but race matters to people for a reason, and that's not a conversation you could just brush over. And it felt weird because, again, especially when they're bringing up specifically Indigenous people who are arguably some of the most marginalized groups of people, it was an odd thing to just kind of brush over of like, these idiots, they thought that it meant it like the original human as opposed to just a race of people, and because back when race mattered to people. And it's like, ooh, I'm not comfortable with that just being glossed over like that. I appreciate it's not the topic of the book, I understand, but it was just an odd thing to bring up in this manner, in this really blasé manner. And again, I appreciate it's future humans and there's the hope that race wouldn't matter, so it would be really alien to us that it would ever have mattered. I felt a bit odd about it because there's so much more to it than just caring about skin color, because there are white passing Black people, there are white passing Indigenous people who have a huge amount of cultural heritage and also ancestral trauma to unpack with that. So there's a lot more to it than just this cursory mention, and that made me feel a little bit uncomfortable. But that's probably just a me being oversensitive thing. The last issue that I have is we do also have another kind of instance of conversations around physical relations in a way that I just don't think was necessary, didn't add anything to the story. I appreciate, again, like I said before, sex doesn't need to mean anything, but in this case it just was like, okay, we're a bit busy at the moment trying to make sure 2 mega corporations and a government don't take over this planet for you to be like, hey, look, I want to be intimate with you. It was a bit weird and unnecessary, and it just didn't add anything to the story. And at this point I think it's also because I was losing my patience, and by this part I really did just want this to be over. That didn't really work for me. And talking of wanting it to be over, I also felt like this part both dragged and was rushed, in the sense that there were bits of the story that were really slow and I just didn't really care. And then all of the big things that were happening when discussing this planet, and it all gets wrapped up in like 50 pages. It just makes no sense to me. By the end of it, we have like a free planet, a public planet, and all of this because of this revolution that happened in 50 pages after we have been with this planet for over a millennia. It just felt weird. It was rushed and slow at the same time. However, one thing that I will discuss that I did really like about this part of the book before we get into a general overview of the entire thing is that, one, I did really appreciate that there was an interesting conversation around government oppression versus corporate oppression, and how we shouldn't be being like, oh, government's better, no, corporations are better. And we should be discussing the oppressor versus the oppressed, as opposed to government versus corporate. Because government and corporate, anyone who is in a position of power has the ability to exploit it, be it privately or publicly. The way that people are like, oh, corporate because the free market, no, fuck that. Government because of democracy, no, fuck that. Oppressor versus oppressed. We always need to frame any kind of social system on who is in power and what they are doing with that power versus the lowest cared for, most marginalized people within that community. In our case, discussing the rights of people of color, queer people, trans people, women. These are things that we need to have as a conversation before we get to the point where we're discussing government versus corporate power. So I think that was an interesting thing that was brought up, the way that we shouldn't idealize governments and we shouldn't idealize corporations. Donald Trump and Elon Musk are equally sucky. That was an interesting conversation for me, and I did appreciate the fact that it brought it up. So as a general overview of the book, to wrap this whole vlog up, is that we have an interesting array of conversations around environment, around public services, and around gentrification, on top of the fact that we have some smaller conversations around personhood, around autonomy, around consent, capitalism, corporate greed, governmental structures, etc. So interesting conversations being had, some of which I did find flawed, some of which I did agree with. I don't need to agree with everything in a book. I'm not vegan. The book is very clearly trying to at least discuss veganism in an interesting manner. That doesn't bother me in the slightest. I did find that some of the arguments were a bit flawed, not specifically about veganism, but just in general, there were some arguments in here that were flawed, but that's okay. As an actual book, as an enjoyable read, I had problems with it. The pacing is not good. It goes super slow, and then at the end of each part, everything gets resolved really, really rushed. This could have either benefited from further fleshing out and becoming a series, or have been condensed down more, or potentially have been like maybe 3 novellas instead. Something. The pacing was very funky in here. I didn't connect on any emotional level to any of the characters. The characters are there specifically to highlight the issues the author is wanting to discuss, as opposed to feel like real emotional people that you feel attached to, in my personal opinion. The writing style felt quite light, which was fine, but it did also feel juvenile at times, especially when it comes to the humor, which I wasn't the biggest fan of. It's not my personal preference. I don't think the writing style is bad. I just don't think that it's normally one that I would gravitate towards. So we've got some pros and some cons going on here. This is a book that I had very mixed feelings about, and for the most part, I am going to give this a very low 3-star. According to my core pile, I have ended up with it being 1 point off of being a 2-star, so it's a 3-star, but only by like the tiniest margin, and that feels right to me. It feels like it is something that is the lowest end of 3 stars physically possible, because there was some really, really interesting like 4-star topics going on in here, accompanied by some definite 2-star conversations and literary devices. So for the most part, a decent book if you want to have a conversation, and especially one that you are okay disagreeing with, because I don't think anyone is going to agree with all of the topics that are in here. I think there are always going to be things that you as a person are going to have pushback against. I think the book is doing that deliberately, but I don't think that if you're reading a book purely for enjoyment, you will like this unless you mesh with the writing style, which I didn't personally. So mixed feelings, but I had an interesting time and an interesting conversation with you all. So Now we're going to talk about what is the next book for me to read in this series. So I'm going to go see what the Orbit recommends is, and we shall see what I'm reading. And we have Some Desperate Glory. This is one that I already own, so I'm going to go pick that up. So the next video is going to be me chatting through Some Desperate Glory by Emily Tesh. So if you liked the way that I discussed and analysed and even divided up the Terraformers book, I hope that you will join me next time when I go through Some Desperate Glory. Now, the purpose of Some Desperate Glory, I am again going to be talking through each part of the book, but with this one I'm also going to compare how much I think that the if you like Terraformers, you'll like Some Desperate Glory comp actually works, and whether or not I agree with Orbit's assessment or whether it is just random marketing, like, oh, this is sci-fi, and I'll just chuck it in the end. How curated or not these recommendations are, we shall see. So I'm very excited to get to this one. I am glad that I chatted about this one and have had some time to go over it all with you. Let me know what your thoughts on Terraformers are, if you've read it, or if you've not read it and weren't planning on reading it and have watched through the video anyway. Let me know if I have changed your mind and made you want to read it. Let me know how you like these kinds of videos as well, especially because they are a new format for me. And yeah, hopefully we'll have a better time with Some Desperate Glory in the next one. But that is all for me for today, so thank you ever so much for watching, and I'll hopefully catch you in another one soon. Bye!